It was a mystery that had haunted the small town for decades. The Harper family, known for their introverted ways and community involvement, vanished without a trace on that fateful summer night. When they didn't show up at the banquet they usually volunteered for and neighbors found the house empty, search parties soon scoured the town. It seemed like the Harpers remained lost to the town and the world for that matter, as detectives ran into dead ends. However, 30 years later, during a routine police interview, their next-door neighbor uttered a confession that reopened the case. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. After the Harper family's disappearance, their little town was never quite the same. Nothing ever seemed to happen before that moment, and no matter how hard the police tried, they were never even able to get a whiff of where they could have gone. The routine interviews were not just out of courtesy, but because the whole town still held on to hope that the Harper family would be found again. People had started to speculate too. Maybe they had just moved without saying anything, or maybe they had taken a plane and gone somewhere. Detective Thomas knew that this was false, however. He had contact with any police department that would listen. He had even contacted immigration, but no one was able to find anything. Still, the police didn't give up, hoping that the cold case that was the Harper family would one day finally reveal an all-important clue so that they might reopen the case once more. They could never have guessed that today would be that day. It was time to interview anyone who had been close to the Harper family again, and it seemed to be Bill's turn. Bill was only 37, meaning he was only 7 years old when it happened. He and the eldest of the Harper family, Evan, had been friends until the moment of their disappearance. These were the words that he would usually say, along with the claim of not remembering much else. However, today seemed to be different as he came in rather nervous. The officers thought nothing of it and simply sat Bill down. "Hey, Billy," the old Detective Thomas said, greeting him with a warm smile as he remembered the first time he sat in front of them, still shaken by the loss of his neighbors and, with it, his best friend. "I'm going to ask you some questions. Please answer them as honestly as your memory allows," Detective Thomas continued. These had been the same words he was using for years of the investigation, but never before had they been this fruitful. He had written down notes of what Bill usually said, but it seemed like he had deviated from the lines he had told the detective and other officers on repeat. No, this time, Billy Layton went off script, and no one had seen it coming. "I only recently remembered this," Bill started off, lying, as his eyes zoomed around the room hesitantly. He was wringing his hands together, a nervous tic he had gotten over the years. Detective Thomas wrote this down, hanging on to Billy's lips with every word he spoke. Not at any age had he shown to have known anything about the family's disappearance. His story usually went along the lines of Billy not having seen Evan or his family for a couple of days prior to their disappearance. Yet, now that seemed to be the furthest from the truth. "You see, my dad was standing on Ms. Harper's porch talking to her, but they looked relatively mad at each other. My mom and Evan looked more so concerned, and my mom just kept glancing over her shoulder. It had been her interrupting the conversation that had caused them to stop talking and instead go inside the Harper's house," Bill explained, as Detective Thomas fervently wrote everything down. "Do you know what the conversation was about? Any clue on the matter?" he asked as soon as he finished writing. Bill immediately shook his head. "No, sir, but I know that it wasn't pretty. Dad was pretty mad when he came back home," Bill answered, which made the detective frown. "Did you hear your father or mother say anything after coming home about what it could have been about?" Detective Thomas asked. Bill became nervous once again. "Nothing that jumped out at the time. I didn't really understand it back then." He was interrupted by the detective. "What made you choose to unveil this information now?" Bill swallowed loudly at this. "I think the people deserve to know where the Harpers are. I think this mystery needs to be solved, and I'm happy to help the police with that, as I too would like to know where they went. My parents never decided to tell me," he answered, and it seemed a satisfactory answer to the detective. Detective Thomas called his team into the briefing room. "All right, everyone, we have new information on the Harper case," he said, tapping the whiteboard. Bill Layton mentioned seeing his parents at the Harpers the day before they disappeared. This could be our break. The team leaned in, eyes wide with anticipation. "We need to verify Bill's story. Let's start by re-interviewing his parents," Thomas continued, scribbling notes. This could change everything. The team quickly agreed on their next steps. "Let's re-interview Bill's parents," Officer Ramirez suggested. "We need to know if what Bill said about the argument is true." Detective Thomas nodded. "Exactly. We have to tread carefully. It's been 30 years. They might not be forthcoming." The team exchanged glances, knowing this would be a delicate operation. "Let's do this right," Thomas concluded. "We owe it to the Harpers." Detective Thomas and Officer Ramirez drove to Bill's parents' house. The old neighborhood looked the same, but the air felt heavier. Knocking on the Laytons' door, they waited. Mrs. Layton opened it, surprise evident on her face. "Detective, officer, what brings you here?" she asked, trying to mask her unease. "We need to ask you some questions about the Harpers," Thomas replied gently. She hesitated, then let them in. The tension was palpable. Inside, Mr. Layton sat stiffly on the couch, his eyes darting nervously. Mrs. Layton busied herself in the kitchen, avoiding eye contact. "Thank you for seeing us," Detective Thomas began, noting their discomfort. "We need to ask about the argument Bill mentioned." Mr. Layton's jaw tightened. "It was a long time ago," he muttered. "We don't remember much." Mrs. Layton's hands shook as she poured coffee. Detective Thomas leaned forward, eyes fixed on Mr. Layton. "Bill told us about an argument with Mrs. Harper. Can you tell us more about it?" Mr. Layton's face flushed. I don't know what Bill thinks he saw," he stammered, shifting uncomfortably. "It was nothing serious." Thomas pressed on. "Please, Mr. Layton, any detail could help." The tension in the room grew, Mrs. Layton's eyes downcast. Mr. Layton's evasiveness only raised more questions. Detective Thomas leaned in closer. "Mr. Layton, we need the truth." Mr. Layton sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "All right," he finally said. "I did have an argument with Mrs. Harper. It was over a personal matter, but it wasn't serious." Mrs. Layton shot him a worried glance. "It had nothing to do with their disappearance," he insisted, his voice shaking. Detective Thomas scribbled notes, sensing there was more to uncover. Turning to Mrs. Layton, Detective Thomas asked, "Did you go inside the Harper's house?" Mrs. Layton nodded reluctantly. "Yes, we went inside, but nothing unusual happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We talked, and then we left." Her hands trembled as she spoke. "Are you sure?" Thomas pressed. She glanced at her husband before nodding again. As Detective Thomas and Officer Ramirez prepared to leave, Ramirez noticed something. Mrs. Layton kept glancing at a locked cabinet. "What's in there?" he asked. She paled. "Oh, just old family stuff," she said quickly. Back at the station, Thomas was certain they needed a warrant. "There's something they're not telling us," he told Ramirez. When the police arrived with the warrant, Mrs. Layton's face fell. Mr. Layton stood behind her, silent. Inside the cabinet, they found old letters and photographs of the Harper family. Among them was a worn diary. "Mrs. Harper's," Ramirez noted, handing it to Thomas. The diary detailed arguments and secrets between the two families. Thomas read the final entries aloud. The night before they disappeared, Mrs. Harper mentioned a confrontation with the Laytons. The officers left, knowing they had to bring Bill back for questioning. At the station, Bill's eyes widened at the diary. "I had no idea about any of this," he insisted, looking shaken. Then he hesitated. "Evan and I had a secret hiding spot in our old treehouse. Maybe there's something there." The officers followed Bill to the backyard, climbing into the worn treehouse. Ramirez found a small wooden box filled with childhood notes between Bill and Evan. "Evan was scared," Thomas observed. "He wrote about his parents hiding something." One note stood out. "Evan mentioned a place in the woods." "Do you know where this is?" Thomas asked. Bill shook his head. Determined, Thomas organized a search party. After hours combing the woods, they stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. Inside, the team found chilling evidence: Harper family belongings. "They were here," Thomas said, tense. The mystery deepened. "We need to figure out what happened next." Detective Thomas and his team searched the cabin, confirming the Harpers had stayed there. "They were trying to escape something serious," Thomas noted, examining the scattered belongings. Noticing a loose board, Thomas pried it up, revealing a hidden trapdoor. "Looks like a basement," he said. Descending, they found a makeshift living area. "They stayed here for a while," Ramirez observed. Among the items, Thomas discovered a journal belonging to Mr. Harper. The entries revealed their fear of the Laytons and their desperate attempt to disappear. The final entry mentioned someone who had promised to help them. "This person is key," Thomas said. Determined, the team traced phone records and found a suspicious payment to a private investigator, Mr. Simmons. "Let's find him," Thomas ordered. When questioned, Simmons admitted he helped the Harpers create new identities. They were desperate to start over, he explained. However, he only had coded messages about their plans. Back at the station, Thomas and his team deciphered the codes, leading them to a safe deposit box. Inside, they found documents and money meant for the Harpers' new life. "This proves they had a plan," Ramirez said. With evidence in hand, Thomas confronted the Laytons. Under pressure, Mr. Layton confessed to blackmailing the Harpers over an old crime. They refused to comply any longer, he admitted. The case had finally unraveled. "Mr. and Mrs. Layton, you're under arrest," Thomas declared. As they were handcuffed, Ramirez read them their rights. "This case is officially reopened," Thomas said, determined to uncover the full truth. With the Laytons in custody, Detective Thomas focused on finding the Harpers. Using clues from Mr. Simmons, the team traced financial transactions, uncovering a pattern. "They've been living under new identities," Thomas noted. After weeks of tracking, they located the Harpers in a small town. Thomas approached their home. "You're safe now," he told them. Mrs. Harper's eyes filled with tears. "We thought this day would never come," she whispered. The Harpers, initially in shock, agreed to return and testify against the Laytons. "It's time to end this," Mr. Harper said. Returning home, they were greeted warmly by neighbors ready to face the trial. At a press conference, Thomas announced the resolution of the 30-year-old case. "Justice has been served," he declared as the town celebrated. During the trial, the Harpers' testimony was crucial. "We lived in fear for years," Mr. Harper said. The court found the Laytons guilty, sentencing them to prison. Cheers erupted outside. "It's finally over," Mrs. Harper sighed in relief. With the Laytons behind bars, the Harpers rebuilt their lives in their hometown. "It feels like coming home," Mr. Harper said as the community welcomed them back. Detective Thomas received a commendation for his dedication. "You never gave up," Ramirez told him. The town honored the Harpers and Thomas in a heartfelt ceremony. "We're grateful to everyone who never stopped searching for the truth," Mr. Harper said. "It was a day of closure, healing, and new beginnings."